Next we have Professor Shannon O'Lear. Shannon's from the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science at the University of Kansas. She's a political geographer with a particular interest in power and violence and how those issues relate to key topics such as climate change and environmental benefits. She's written a book on environmental geopolitics, and during this talk we'll bring that perspective to conservation. So welcome, Shannon.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. As I told the Vice Chancellor at lunch, I said, Oxford has Alice in Wonderland, Kansas has Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. And she immediately understood, okay, gotcha. She knew right where I was from. So this is, I'm here because Tim Hodgetts came to the American Association of Geographers meeting last year and saw me present on this, which is a book that I wrote that came out last March. And he asked if I could take this similar approach to conservation, and I said, absolutely, that would be fantastic. And it's been a wonderful opportunity to dive into the work that a lot of you are doing, and that's what I will be doing in my talk today. So this book, I kind of made it up because it didn't exist. And it's been in my head for so long, and I've been teaching this class for so long. And I wanted to question some of these common narratives that we hear about population and resources, resource conflict, climate security. And these are things that I've worked on for a long time, but I'm troubled by how they're handled in the popular media and even by dominant scholarship. So I wrote this book to interrogate some of those things. I'm taking a similar approach to wildlife conservation today. So I brought the geopolitics. All right, so first I'm going to use the D word. We're going to get comfortable with the D word today. We're going there. Okay, so I want you to think about discourses as a way of telling a story, as a way of framing or a narrative. And there's always multiple possible discourses at any one time. But what it's doing is it's trying to naturalize, stabilize, and promote a particular view or agenda. So for a geopolitical discourse, we're really looking at the production of geographical knowledge. We're looking at how spatial relationships are being explained. We're looking at dynamics of power and how they're justified or possibly obscured. So it's interesting to me to think about how environmental knowledge is being produced and used to portray and promote particular views of the world. So this presentation is coming at you in two parts. First of all, we're going to talk about, actually I'm going to be doing most of the talking, geopolitical discourse in four forms. We're used to thinking of discourse analysis, if we even want to go anywhere near it, as being an analysis of texts and documents. So I'm going to disrupt that whole understanding of discourse. And then I'm going to talk about these three observations of environmental geopolitics that I use in my book to look at all the other topics I mentioned. So, how do we know a discourse when we see it? And I look at discourse not just as text or narratives. That's certainly one form that they arrive in. But I also want you to think about discourse in the form of materiality, as embodiment or identity, and also in practice. And we're going to go through these examples. All right, so geopolitical discourse as text or narrative. This is really how are we telling the story of wildlife conservation through TV ad campaigns, policy documents, speeches, popular media, maps, data visualizations, graphics and images. We can think of text, these kinds of text or narratives as being verbal and visual. And this is the most commonly understood type of discourse. So another form of discourse is discourse as materiality. And these are the physical aspects of, say, conservation, knowledge, and values. And in this example here, this is the physical, tangible aspects of conservation. Here we're controlling space, creating a territory and boundaries in the actual real world. another example of geopolitical discourse as materiality is how we control and track things. The use of technology, these material devices that we're using in these practices of conservation. And this is a shout out to a colleague of mine, John Casellas-Connors at the University of Texas, who's doing some really interesting work in suburban expansion and deer populations and looking at it through the lens of the Anthropocene and sort of where do we draw the line between what is human and what is wild. But this is also he's looking at very material aspects of what happens with the changing physical relationships when we expand the suburbs. All right, so then geopolitical discourse as embodiment or identity. This form of discourse has to do with how we label and group things. And this kind of goes back to what Kate Rayworth was saying this morning about renaming relationships. And this is, as you all know, Tim Hodgett's work here, where he's looking at the idea of invasive versus alien species. But we can also think about this in terms of how we generate categories of things, how we generate lists, priorities, and underlying those, because as a discourse, what it's doing is it's carrying forward certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of evidence, and the values that those indicate. Okay, if I asked you to identify the identity discourse in this slide, you have several choices. First of all, we have Uma Thurman, the celebrity identity, and I think there's been quite a bit of work on kind of using celebrities to amplify conservation work. Rosaline mentioned NGOs courting corporations, so there's been a lot of work done on this. But also identifying the charismatic megafauna of a rhinoceros, as this is something that is to be prioritized. But in this headline, we also have the vicious poachers. We've labeled them as the bad guys, and it's as if we already know the whole story there. And the story actually has some momentum, certainly. Once we involve Interpol, this attention elevates the cause of this poaching and the terrorists and the violence. And so we're telling a particular story, not necessarily going very deep. And the dangerous thing, of course, when we use these kinds of labels like poachers and equating them with terrorists, is we assume that everything we know about all terrorists in the world applies to this particular group of people. So these labels can be very dangerous, and they can hide a lot of information. And this goes back to, Rosaline set me up very nicely for this slide, thank you. What happens when we securitize conservation? What kind of doors does that open, and what perspectives does that obscure from view? I was really interested to listen to Rosaline's talk because it parallels so much with work that I've done on climate security and the militarization of climate. So this is another, once we label conservation as a military or a security issue, what roads does that take us down? Okay, and then finally, our fourth type of discourse is geopolitical discourse as practice. So here, whoops, I missed one. Okay, pretend that you were looking here at a slide on ecotourism. I have this fantastic picture of a Mole National Park and a bunch of teenagers just making a crazy pose in front of the ecotourism sign. It struck me as funny. So how are we engaging with wildlife? What is our role, our responsibility? What are our options? And are we the only actors with agency? So practice as discourse raises these kinds of questions. What kinds of things are we doing? There's also policy implementation and this notion of best practices. And we might want to ask, best for whom or for what? Are these practices deemed best? And who hasn't been subjected to having conservation practices urged upon us? We've all seen these kinds of signs in the hotel that say, if you really care about the planet and the giraffes, or pick your megafauna of your choice, you will reuse your linens and you'll reuse your towels and save water and conserve and save the planet and do your part. But as soon as we make a cup of coffee in the hotel room, we've already generated a bunch of plastic waste. So sometimes there are contradictions in how we practice conservation. Okay, so there we have it, our 4 forms of discourse, so text, materiality, identity, and practice. So what I would like to do is examine these discourses by making 3 observations. So in some of the dominant discourses about conservation, the role and the meaning of the environment are rarely specified. This is a journal, a special journal of Society and Animals, in which the whole idea is to question, can we even separate wildlife from humans? And some of you have probably already seen this. I thought this was a really nice introduction to sort of the anthropocenic questions about the separability of humans and environment and other binaries that are embedded in common geographical framings. This is my favorite. Getting into the topic of biopolitics and the idea of governance and who gets to decide what kinds of things do we make live, what kinds of things do we let die. And what I'm really interested in here is the role of science. And what kinds of science are we drawing on as evidence that we bring into these discourses about what kinds of things should we be making live or letting die? And there's been a lot of really interesting work that questions assumptions about the meaning of wild and nature. Alexandra Zimmerman's talk this morning, where she was looking at the diversity of cultural meaning, I think also gets to these points. So the second observation I would make about some of the dominant discourses of conservation is that humans' role tends to be considered selectively. So we often miss the fact, although it's coming up here in a lot of the papers and discussion, that some humans may be negatively impacted by conservation practices, where we prioritize the conservation practice and we sort of overlook some of the negative impacts. And these impacts are rendered often invisible given policies and priorities. One of the more interesting papers that I read in my research was by Callie Doubleday, who did field work near this tiger reserve where they've reintroduced tigers in the Sariska area of India. And what she found is that a negative impact of the reintroduction and prioritization of tigers is domestic violence. So women are often in charge of leading the animals out to fodder, but if they can't get there because the tigers are out that day or what have you, if those animals don't come home producing enough milk for market, oftentimes those women fall victim to physical abuse in their own homes. But this violence is rendered invisible because we're focused on saving the tigers. So it's one of those contradictions of practices and priorities. So what are we looking at in conservation? What is the role and the impacts on humans? So the third observation that I would make about dominant discourses of conservation is that often insufficient attention is paid to spatial dimensions of human-environment interactions. And yes, I realize I'm throwing in there that problematic binary, but just roll with it. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about aquatic ecosystems, only because I haven't addressed them at all yet. And I want to talk a little bit about how we visualize environmental features. So this would be that kind of textual narrative. And I'm going to show you an example from Global Fishing Watch. And their motto is sustainability through transparency, which sounds fantastic. But we have to pay attention to how it's both revealing and concealing information. And more importantly, how by producing this particular visual, we are producing a territory or a space in need of conservation. So this is the kind of thing that the Global Fishing Watch produces. It's very similar actually to the Global Forest Watch, if you're familiar with that platform. And so here we see, oh, we are getting a story of what's going on with the world's fishing and where we need to watch out and where the boats are and who's doing the fishing, and we can look at the, over time, and we can look at different data layers, and it feels like there's a lot of information that we can access, and so we know what's going on. And these visualizations shape our geographical understanding. But we also need to ask who is generating or filtering these data, who has access to these data, and how granular or usable are the data, and how does this information shape practices on the ground, or in this case, in the sea. All right, another great example from a geopolitical perspective about spatial dimensions is the example of the Sargasso Sea. So we like to map things and control things. You know, it's traditional geopolitics that we kind of want to control space, understand space, predict space. So we're trying to fix a boundary around the Sargasso Sea, and this has been a challenge for a long time. We're trying to impose these traditional geopolitical notions and rigid territorial boundaries on something that is very fluid. So the Sargasso Sea, if you're familiar with it, it's sort of like a large floating ecosystem. And it shifts in composition, it moves in location, it changes in volume, and it defies all traditional Cartesian two-dimensional geopolitics, which is fantastic. It makes it something really interesting to look at. But it shows us how we kind of fall short when we are trying to use our traditional geopolitical command and control types of approaches. Also, I pulled this up from a paper from Bill Lawrence that he floated around the internet. And I think this is an interesting, his road ecology framework. It helps us to think in terms of multiple simultaneous spatial scales and dynamic processes. So when we look at global shipping and transit systems, and we look at aquatic mammal migratory ecosystems, we're focused on networks and movements, which is great, as opposed to fixed spaces and boundaries, which are also relevant, but not always the whole story. And this also gets to Sam Cushman's work this morning on connectivity. It's absolutely spot on. These are the kinds of creative ways and geopolitical approaches that we need to be thinking about. Okay, so to recap, you guys have been through a lot already. So we have our 4 forms of discourse. We have our text, our documents, ads, speeches, our verbal, our visual. We have materiality, which is physical space, entities, beings, technologies. We have identity as a discourse, labels, categories, lists, and practices, which are engagements, interventions, policy implementations. Each of these forms of discourse brings with it a body of knowledge, a way of seeing the world, a way that sort of justifies this is the action that we need to take. But there's never just one. There are always multiple. But there tends to be 1 or 2 that become dominant, that come to the fore. And that's what I'm suggesting that we could be questioning. So all of these are stabilizing and promoting a particular view or perspective, and they're embracing particular forms of geographic knowledge. And then I offered my 3 observations here that help to question and critique these discourses. How are they helpful? How are they limited? What are we missing? So what's the point? What's the point? I was asking my students this. What's the point? You should have a point. To recognize and generate different ways of understanding human-environment interactions. So if we look at the point of all of this, how might we identify limited or narrow discourses? How might we interrupt them and generate more inclusive and just ways of living? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Shannon. Probably time for a question for Shannon. Oh, at the back there. Hold on 1 second just for the mic.
The job of most conservation organizations is to promote a discourse. To what degree should the average conservation group, whether it's focused on a single species or a group of species or environmentalism writ large, to what degree is it the onus on them to be looking at their own discourse and being critical of it?
I think that would be central to the job, to know what they're promoting and why, and also being able to explain why that particular discourse. So it would also be helpful to understand, and which most of them I would assume do, what the competing discourses are and why the one that they're promoting is the one of choice for that particular organization. That would be my answer.
Thank you again, Shannon. That was great.